The rooftop ballroom was a sea of glass and gold, overlooking the shimmering New York City skyline. It was supposed to be the happiest night of my life. The champagne had just been poured, and the bubbles caught the light like tiny diamonds. My white gown trailed behind me, heavy and elegant, as the string quartet softened their melody into something sweet and romantic. I looked at my fiancé, Marcus, and felt like the luckiest woman in the world. We were surrounded by the city's most powerful people: politicians, corporate titans, and influencers with their phones already out, live streaming the event to millions. It was a fairy tale come true. Then, the music stopped abruptly. My future mother-in-law, Eleanor, stepped forward and asked for the microphone. She had a sharp, polished smile that usually made me feel welcomed, but tonight, it looked like a blade. She turned toward the massive LED wall behind the dance floor, which usually showed photos of our travels. "Before this marriage proceeds," she said, her voice dripping with a sweetness that didn't reach her eyes, "our family believes in absolute transparency." The screen flickered. Instead of a sunset photo, a medical lab report appeared in high definition. Gasps rippled through the 200 guests as they saw my name next to words like identity discrepancy and juvenile court record. I stood frozen as the room turned into a cage of whispers. The LED screen glowed with a DNA result that claimed I wasn't who I said I was. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. "My name is Amy Linche. I am 25 years old. Until that exact second, I believed I knew every single thing about my life and my history. I grew up with a mother who loved me, went to the best schools, and worked my way up to a position of respect. But looking at that screen, I saw a version of myself I didn't recognize, a girl with a sealed record and a biological trail that didn't match my passport. I looked at Marcus, expecting him to take my hand, to tell his mother to stop this madness. Instead, he stepped back. The warmth in his eyes had vanished, replaced by a cold, hard judgment. He looked at me as if I were a stranger, or worse, a common criminal who had broken into his home. The guests were holding their phones up, capturing every second of my crumbling life. I felt the weight of 1,000 eyes judging a story I didn't even know. In one moment, I went from a bride to a public scandal. "I can't marry someone built on lies," Marcus said, his voice loud enough for the nearest live-streaming phones to catch. His words were a physical blow. Before I could even open my mouth to defend myself, 2 heavy-set security guards appeared at my sides. They didn't ask me to leave. They escorted me out, their hands firm on my silk sleeves. I was led past the tiered cake that would never be cut and out of the ballroom. I found myself standing on West 57th Street, still in my wedding dress, while taxis hissed past like indifferent witnesses to my ruin. The cold night air bit at my skin. My phone began to buzz in my hand, a relentless, terrifying vibration. It was everyone. Reporters wanting a comment, friends asking if it was true, and strangers leaving hateful messages on my social media. I realized then that I had no one left to call. My adoptive mother had passed away when I was 16, and she was my only world. By midnight, the video of my humiliation was trending on every local news site. By the time the sun came up, I received an automated email. I was unemployed. Marcus's family owned the firm that funded the nonprofit where I worked. They didn't just break my heart, they erased my life. The next 3 days were a blur of shadows and silence. I stayed in my small apartment, the curtains drawn, watching my reputation burn to ash on the news. I wondered how they had found that DNA report and why they chose that specific moment to destroy me. Then, a knock came at the door. I expected a process server or a journalist, but instead, I found a man in a sharp gray suit. He introduced himself as a private attorney who had flown down from Boston specifically to see me. He requested a confidential meeting, his face grave and professional. We sat at my small kitchen table as he laid out a folder of documents. "The DNA test shown at the wedding was real, Amy," he said quietly. My breath hitched, but it was incomplete, very intentionally incomplete. He explained that my biological father hadn't abandoned me. He was a brilliant financial analyst who had died 20 years ago under mysterious circumstances. Before he died, he had been a whistleblower. He had gathered evidence against a massive real estate conglomerate that was forcing families into foreclosure to seize their land. My blood ran cold when I saw the name of the company. It was the same conglomerate that funded Marcus's family and my wedding. The attorney leaned forward, his eyes locking onto mine. There was a trust, Amy. Your biological father set it up before he died, and your adoptive mother kept it hidden to protect you from the people who killed his career. He explained that the trust was designed to be activated only when I turned 25. My birthday had been exactly 2 weeks before the wedding date. My heart skipped a beat as he turned the page to show the financial breakdown. The trust didn't just contain a little bit of money for college or a house. It contained 38% of the shares in the holding company that owned the entire empire. Marcus's father ran. It was a massive stake, enough to give me significant power over their every move. My adoptive mother had spent her life making sure I was safe, keeping this secret until the law legally transferred the voting power to me. The timing clicked into place like a key in a lock. The wedding humiliation wasn't about Marcus's values or his mother's transparency. They had found out about the trust. They knew that the week of the wedding was the same week I became their most powerful shareholder. They didn't want a daughter-in-law. They wanted to disqualify a rival. I realized then that the DNA reveal was a calculated business move. It wasn't about the shame of my past. It was a desperate attempt to discredit me before I could ever step foot into a board meeting. If they could make me look like a fraud, a liar, or someone who was mentally unstable due to a shattered identity, they could argue to the board of directors that I was unfit to exercise my shareholder rights. They tried to erase me publicly so that I would be too broken to act privately. They wanted me to run away, to hide in shame, and perhaps sign over my rights just to make the bullying stop. They thought that a 25-year-old girl in a torn wedding dress would be an easy target. They assumed I would be so devastated by Marcus's betrayal that I wouldn't look at the legal fine print. But they didn't know the girl they were dealing with. They didn't realize that being raised by a mother who had to hide the truth had made me observant and resilient. They had given me their best shot, and I was still standing. The shame was gone, replaced by a cold, sharpening anger. The attorney gave me a choice. I could sell my shares back to the company for a massive amount of money. I could take the millions, disappear to a different country, change my name again, and live a life of luxury where no one knew my face. I could leave the humiliation behind and let the shadows win. Or I could fight. I could look directly at the people who had thrown me out of my own wedding like trash and walk right back into their lives. I could walk into their sanctuary, the boardroom, and sit at the head of their table. I thought about the families my biological father tried to save. I thought about the way Marcus looked at me on the rooftop, like I was something he needed to wash off his shoes. The choice wasn't actually hard at all. I'm not selling, I told the attorney. I want a seat at the table. He gave me a small, rare smile and started pulling out more files. We spent the next 48 hours preparing. If they wanted a war based on transparency, I was going to give them more than they ever bargained for. The morning of the first board meeting was freezing. I didn't wear a dress this time. I wore a tailored black suit and carried a leather briefcase that felt like a shield. When I walked into the mahogany-lined boardroom, the silence was so thick you could cut it. Marcus's father, the CEO, refused to even make eye contact with me. He shuffled his papers, pretending I was a ghost. The other board members looked uncomfortable, shifting in their expensive chairs. I took my seat at the spot reserved for the largest individual shareholder. I didn't wait for an introduction. I opened my folder and immediately requested an independent audit of the company's foreclosure practices between the years 2007 and 2010. The room turned even colder. Marcus's father finally looked up, his face reddening. He called for an immediate vote to dismiss my request, claiming it was a personal vendetta and a waste of company resources. The board, mostly made up of his old friends, voted no in a chorus of hushed voices. They thought that was the end of it. They underestimated me. They forgot that while they held the big seats, they didn't hold all of them. I didn't let the no vote discourage me. I knew the rules of their game better than they did now. Over the next week, I started a quiet, relentless campaign. I didn't go to the press, and I didn't post on social media. Instead, I went to the people who actually held the power behind the scenes. I scheduled meetings with the heads of pension funds, the teachers' retirement boards, and the union investors who owned smaller but vital percentages of the company. I didn't go in there crying about my wedding. I went in there with hard data. I showed them foreclosure clusters that didn't make sense. I showed them internal memos I had recovered from my father's old digital archives, data he had backed up on a private server before his accident. I showed them how the company had intentionally targeted low-income neighborhoods to pad their profits. I never once raised my voice. I spoke in the language of facts, risk management, and fiduciary duty. I told them that the current leadership was a liability that would eventually sink their investments. The gray-haired men and women across the tables began to listen very, very closely. While I worked behind the scenes, the video of my wedding humiliation stayed online. It had millions of views now. My lawyer asked if I wanted to file a series of takedown notices to protect my image. I told him no. I wanted it to stay exactly where it was. Whenever a reporter managed to corner me on the street and asked why I wasn't trying to hide, I gave them the same answer every time. Transparency matters. I have nothing to hide, but I wonder if the board can say the same? Slowly, the tide of public sympathy began to shift. People started to move past the lying bride narrative and started asking why a wealthy family would go to such extreme lengths to publicly destroy a young woman. The internet sleuths started digging into the company's history. They found old news clips about my father's whistleblowing. The outrage that had been directed at me started to turn toward the people who had held the microphone on that rooftop. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was a symbol of someone fighting back against a giant. The humiliation was becoming my greatest asset. One evening, Marcus sent me a message asking for a private meeting at a quiet cafe. He looked terrible, pale, tired, and nervous. He told me that he hadn't known the full extent of his parents' plan. He claimed they had only told him they found evidence I was a security risk, and that he had panicked in the heat of the moment. He looked at me with those same eyes that used to make me melt, and he slid my engagement ring across the table. It sparkled under the dim cafe lights, a symbol of the life I thought I wanted. He whispered that we could start over, that he could help me manage the board if I just stepped back a little. I looked at the ring, then I looked at him. I saw a man who was afraid of losing his inheritance, not a man who was sorry for breaking my heart. I realized he was just another tool his father was trying to use to neutralize me. I didn't pick up the ring. I left it sitting there on the cold table and walked out without saying a single word. He wasn't part of my story anymore. 2 weeks later, the atmosphere in the boardroom was completely different. The air felt electric, charged with the scent of an impending storm. The independent shareholders I had met with, the teachers, the firefighters, the union workers, had formed a coalition. When the motion for an external audit was brought to the floor again, the room stayed silent for a long beat. Then, one by one, the hands went up. The coalition held enough voting power to override the CEO's inner circle. The audit passed. I watched Marcus's father as the results were announced. His jaw tightened so hard I thought it might snap. His face went from red to a sickly, pale gray. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw real fear in his eyes. He realized that the backup server my father had left behind wasn't just a myth. It was a ticking time bomb. The audit wasn't just going to look at numbers. It was going to look at the blood on the walls of this company's history. The game had officially changed, and I was the one holding the cards. The empire didn't go down without a fight. Within days of the audit passing, a regulatory probe was launched from Atlanta. It was a clear political favor for Marcus's father. They tried to challenge the legitimacy of my trust, claiming the signatures were forged or that the activation clause was invalid. They tied me up in court for hours, trying to stall the audit by burying my legal team in paperwork. They thought they could bleed my bank account dry or exhaust my spirit, but my biological father had been a man who prepared for the worst. The trust was airtight, drafted by some of the best legal minds of his generation, and protected by layers of security that even a governor's influence couldn't pierce. Every time they threw a legal hurdle in my path, my attorney was ready with a countermove. We weren't just defending. We were gaining ground. The more they fought to hide the truth, the more guilty they looked to the public and the other shareholders. Their desperation was becoming the very thing that was destroying them. When the audit findings finally came back, they were even worse than I had imagined. The auditors discovered a series of internal strategy documents labeled the acceleration model. These documents proved that the company had intentionally fast-tracked foreclosures in lower-income neighborhoods, often using illegal tactics to confuse homeowners who were only a few days late on payments. They had created a machine that fed on the misfortune of others. Deep in the digital archives, we found my father's name. His signature appeared on dozens of dissent memos. He had been the lone voice of conscience in a room full of greed. The records showed he was pushed out of the company only months before his death, branded as a disgruntled employee to ruin his credibility, the exact same tactic they tried to use on me at the wedding. Seeing his words on those pages made the fight personal in a way it hadn't been before. I wasn't just fighting for my shares, I was finishing the work he had started 20 years ago. The national press picked up the story shortly after the audit was released. It wasn't a local society scandal anymore. It became a headline story on every major financial news network. But the focus wasn't on the wedding dress or the DNA test. The press focused on how the teachers' pensions and public funds had been exposed to this predatory scheme. The narrative shifted from romance to public harm. The image of the humiliated bride was replaced by the image of a corporate whistleblower's daughter standing up for thousands of families. Now, the company wasn't just facing a shareholder revolt, they were facing a total collapse of public trust. People were protesting outside their office buildings. The stock price started to plummet as investors scrambled to get out before the federal investigators moved in. It was no longer a private war between two families. It was a reckoning for a company that had built its empire on the suffering of the vulnerable. Marcus and his parents were now the ones being hounded by the cameras, forced to hide their faces as they left their luxury apartments. The pressure became too much for the board of directors to handle. 3 independent directors, who had previously been neutral, resigned in a single day, citing ethical irreconcilability. Their departure sent the stock into a freefall. The major institutional investors demanded an immediate restructuring of the entire leadership team. They knew that as long as Marcus's father was in charge, the company was toxic. I sat in my apartment, watching the ticker symbols turn red on my screen. I didn't feel joy at their loss, but I felt a profound sense of justice. The empire was cracking, and it was cracking because it was built on a foundation of lies. They had tried to use the truth to destroy me, but the actual truth was now destroying them. I received a call from the chairman of the board, a man who had previously ignored my existence. He sounded old and defeated. He wanted to know what it would take for me to stop the public pressure. I told him I wasn't the one he should be asking. He needed to talk to the people his company had hurt. Marcus's father requested a private, off-the-record meeting at a secure location. He didn't bring lawyers this time. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in weeks. He offered me a buyout that was far above the current market value of my shares. "Take the money, Amy," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "You can have more wealth than you ever dreamed of. Just end this, retract your statements, say the audit was flawed, and go live your life." He was still trying to buy his way out of the consequences. He didn't understand that for me, the money was never the point. I already had the trust. I was already wealthy beyond my needs. I looked at him and saw the man who had ordered my humiliation, the man who had likely played a role in my father's downfall. "I'm not here for the money," I said firmly. "I'm here for the company." I declined the offer and walked away, leaving him alone in the room with his fading power. There would be no secret deals and no easy exits. Just when it seemed like the corporate fight had reached its peak, my attorney found a final, hidden clause in the trust documents. It was a fail-safe my father had included, perhaps knowing the risks he was taking. The clause stated that if fraud connected to the original whistleblower's evidence was ever legally proven, the holder of the trust would gain temporary emergency control authority over the board to ensure the company's survival. It was a legal nuclear option that had never been invoked in the history of the firm. My attorney explained that the audit findings, combined with the internal memos we recovered, were enough to trigger it. This wasn't just about having a seat at the table anymore. This was about taking the gavel. I had the power to step in as an interim overseer, to halt all current operations, and to force a total purge of the executive level. The trap my father had set 20 years ago was finally ready to spring. I gave my attorney the green light to file the motion. The final blow came from an unexpected source. A former executive, who had been silent for decades, came forward after seeing the news reports. He had kept a copy of a secret memo from the months leading up to my father's death. The memo explicitly instructed the legal and PR staff to neutralize the reputational risk tied to the Whitmore line, referring to my biological family. The word neutralize was cold and terrifying. It proved that my father wasn't just a victim of a bad economy. He was the target of a deliberate, organized hit. The memo also showed that they had been tracking my adoptive mother for years, waiting to see if she would ever try to claim the trust. They had planned the wedding reveal months ahead of time, knowing exactly when my 25th birthday was. They had welcomed me into their family with the sole intention of destroying me at the perfect legal moment. Seeing the proof of their long-term cruelty was the final piece of the puzzle. It wasn't a sudden panic, it was a long-term conspiracy. The board held a closed-door session where Marcus was called to testify. He was forced to sign a sworn affidavit about what he knew. In a moment of total cowardice, or perhaps a final spark of conscience, he admitted that his parents had orchestrated the entire wedding reveal. He confessed that they had hired private investigators to dig up my past and had coached him on exactly what to say when the screen turned on. He admitted the goal was to crash my credibility, so I could never use the trust to challenge his father's control. When his testimony was read aloud to the remaining board members, the room went completely silent. Even his closest allies couldn't defend him anymore. The betrayal was so total, so calculated, that it sickened everyone in the room. Marcus had sold out the woman he supposedly loved for a company that was already rotting from the inside. His affidavit was the final nail in the coffin for the family's legacy. Using the emergency clause in the trust, I called an emergency board session. This time, I didn't sit at the side. I walked to the head of the table. The independent directors, terrified of being sued for breach of fiduciary duty, immediately sided with me. We initiated a vote for the immediate removal of the CEO and the entire executive committee. Marcus's father sat in the corner, his face a mask of frozen rage, but he didn't have the votes to stop it. The motion passed by a narrow 2% margin, the exact percentage represented by the shares I had quietly bought during the PR crash. I was now the acting head of the firm. My first act was to suspend all foreclosure proceedings nationwide and invite federal investigators to have full access to our servers. The backup server my father left behind had finally become the main server. The old guard was out, and for the first time in 20 years, the company was under the control of someone who cared about more than just the bottom line. A week later, I held my own press conference. I chose the same rooftop ballroom where the wedding was supposed to have happened. The skyline was the same, glittering and vast, but I was a different person. I didn't wear a white gown. I wore a structured white suit, a symbol of my new authority. The same reporters who had filmed my humiliation were there, but this time, they were waiting for my words. I didn't offer any theatrics or emotional pleas. I presented numbers. I announced the removal of the old leadership and the creation of a massive restitution fund for the families impacted by the acceleration model. I also announced that 20% of all future developments would be converted into affordable housing. I told the world that the company would no longer be a predator, it would be a partner in the city's growth. I looked directly into the cameras, knowing Marcus and his family were watching from wherever they were hiding. "You tried to expose me," I said calmly. "Thank you for the opportunity." The fall of the family was swift. Federal investigators opened multiple inquiries into fraud and racketeering. Marcus's father was forced to resign from every corporate and charitable board he sat on. The investors filed a massive class action lawsuit against him for breach of fiduciary duty, stripping away much of his personal fortune. The empire didn't collapse, but it restructured without him. He was left watching from the outside as the company he had stolen and corrupted was transformed into something he no longer recognized. Marcus disappeared from the social scene entirely, his name now synonymous with betrayal and corporate greed. They had tried to make me a pariah, but in the end, they were the ones who couldn't show their faces in the city they thought they owned. The justice wasn't just financial, it was absolute. They had lost their power, their reputation, and their future, all because they forgot that the truth has a way of coming home. Months later, I returned to that rooftop one last time. It wasn't for a wedding or a board meeting. It was for the official launch of the Whitmore Housing Initiative, named after my biological father. The room was filled with the families who had once faced eviction because of this company's greed. They weren't politicians or influencers. They were real people whose lives were finally being made whole again. One elderly woman, who had almost lost her home of 40 years, came up to me and hugged me tightly. She whispered, "Your father would be so proud of you, Amy." Hearing those words meant more to me than any engagement ring or any amount of stock options ever could. I looked out at the skyline and felt a sense of peace I hadn't known since I was a child. I had found my name, my history, and my purpose. I wasn't the girl in the torn dress anymore. I was the architect of something new. The New York City skyline looked exactly the same as it did on my wedding night. Gold, glass, and infinite. But it felt completely different to me now. They had tried to humiliate me out of power, thinking I was weak and easily broken. Instead, their cruelty had activated the very power they were so afraid of. I didn't burn the empire down to the ground. I rewired it. I turned a machine of destruction into a force for good. When the reporters asked me if I would ever forgive Marcus or his parents for what they did to me on that rooftop, I looked at the city I now helped protect and gave them an honest answer. I don't need to forgive them, I said, because I've already moved past them. The city remembers what they did, and now, so do they. I turned my back on the cameras and walked toward the people who actually mattered. My name is Amy Linche, and I finally know exactly who I am.